everybody, welcome back. Episode 14 of our podcast of Get Rich. If you're new here, welcome, and we talk about personal finance, financial literacy, investing. And today, very interesting topic because we're going to be talking about something new that helps people spend, which is out of the usual topic that we discuss, which is investing. So about spending again, which is buy now, pay later. So Edmund, ikaw, nakagamit ka na ba ng buy now, pay later?
The answer is no, okay? But I guess it's important because it's like a worldwide phenomenon right now.
Yes.
So it's not just in the Philippines, but globally, really, buy now, pay later has just
Getting famous.
become, that's probably a overstatement, but it's just leapt off the ground, right? Yeah. So I had to come in prepared and bring people some data. So to give people context, the global BNPL market rose to $231 billion last year, okay? And this is a CAGR or total growth rate of around 21% over the last 3 years.
Yeah, which is big.
Which is big. And forecast is still assuming 10 to 14%. Some even have, like, for certain countries, like 40% CAGR in the next 5 years. But on average, you're probably sitting around 10 to 14% in the next 5 years. The reason why we're talking about BNPL is because we always talk about credit. We always talk about debt. It can be a double-edged sword. It's good if you know how to use it and you're prudent with your spending. But then if you don't know how to use it and you just use it excessively, then you hear about those Reddit scary stories or horror stories of people having laki-laki ng utang ko, hindi ko mabayaran, diba?
So would buy now, pay later, do you think it's something good for... Kasi diba we always say that money is behavioral. It's not technical. So personally, do you believe that it's something good for example, for Filipinos or...
To some extent, I think it is. It gives people some financial flexibility. That one I agree. And if you look at the story of the last 2 years, there's always that story of inflation where things are becoming more expensive. In fact, inflation accelerated the last 2 years. Now it's a little bit down. And the point being of inflation, that if you spend today, right, it's probably cheaper than spending it the next year or 2 years from now, because the assumption is that things are going to become more expensive. There are some instances where you know how to maximize what you have. That's not an issue. So if you can really get a good deal, if you think about it, some BNPL provide 1 year's worth of interest-free, which is staggered over 12 months, gives you plenty of flexibility. You don't pay an additional interest. That's not the problem. The problem occurs is that if you pay more than a year, ayan na. Lumalabas na yung mga hidden fees or hidden charges that on average, you look at it, syempre monthly installment lang tinitignan mo. Yung pala, it's 20% more over the next year.
Yes.
Right? So these are things that you have to take into consideration whenever you're doing anything, whether credit card payments, BNPL. Is it alarming today? If I look at it on face value, like for example, household savings rate in the Philippines, it's been trending a little bit down, but it's sitting at around 25%. So I thought it was relatively low compared to some of the Asian peers. But our Asian peers, for example, like Singapore, the richer countries, for example, in Asia, 50%. But then you look at some other countries, like in Europe, some are actually a lot less than us, sitting at 10, 11%.
Which is their savings rate?
Which is their savings rate. That actually astonished me. Philippines is not so bad compared to globally in terms of savings rate. But obviously, there are other factors that you should take into consideration.
That's true.
I mean, we always talk about healthcare. We're always one sickness away from going bankrupt. The richer countries usually don't have that problem because the government takes care of them for basic necessities. So these are bits and pieces that, from a citizen or from a Filipino standpoint, you should understand. Let's just put this maybe into a nutshell. Is there something alarming on face value and data? I thought there was because of how many people were using BNPL. But household savings rate, 25%. Not so bad, although it's trending down. Total credit card, total value last year was 3.4 trillion. This is around 11% of total GDP. Other countries actually are sitting at 100%, 70%. South Korea.
Crazy.
But the thing is, they know how to use it. They have to, I think it's just that you have to be financially savvy enough to understand that if you use it, let's say, for example, like Singapore, which is 100%. 100%, and we're 11, they just know how to use it correctly. I think that's just the point, right?
I think speaking from personal experience, the first time I got a credit card, I would be honest na mas magastos ako when I had a credit card. So it really forced me to be more aware of my finances because like when you have a credit card, tap ka lang dito, tap ka, unlike like there's this psychological effect na when you're putting in cash, paying in cash, ano ba yan, nawala. But when you're paying in credit card, sige, ganyan. Tapos sometimes, when you're with your friends, okay, ako nang gubayad kasi credit card ko na, bayaran nyo na lang ako. Like, even if they pay you, the fact that you pay it when you see the bill, parang,
Nakakagulat, diba?
Nakakagulat. I spent this amount on food. But when you think about it, nagbayad naman sila sa'yo. But there's just effect na parang ang gastos ko.
And that's why my wife is always pissed at me. Kasi ba't lagi ako debit card?
Yeah. So you pay in...
So why do I always, usually, all the things I do is debit card, right? Kasi at least in my mind, parang binayaran ko na, nalugi na ako.
Exactly, di ba?
May points eh.
Oo, may points.
May points, may cashback, may whatever, di ba? That's how they entice you to spend more.
And I think that's also one of the ways that BNPL is doing it. Kasi there's this stat. In discretionary spending, because of BNPL, it increased discretionary spending by 30%. 30%. And that's big. I think in our field, when it comes to investing, the biggest challenge with what we do, if it's like investing is not mandatory for people, is the reality is hindi mo kalaban si BPI, si BDO, or other insurance companies when it comes to investing, because you're all trying to help the financial lives of people. Pero the reality is, yung kalaban mo talaga are these things. Now, where should I allocate my finite money for the month? Is it going to be spent on BNPL or credit card, or Filipinos also the rise of gambling sites? So I think the point here is that this is another option for us to be to use it, but again, to be wiser.
Well, dapat nga BNPL sa stock market eh.
Pwede, no? Options.
Dapat gawin natin option yun sa COL eh. Diba? Parang bumili ka ng 10,000 worth, but you can pay this over 5 months, diba?
After 3 months mo na babayaran.
Diba? Anyway, I mean, maybe you can share more data about Philippine BNPL.
Okay, sige.
This purpose of the podcast is really trying to bring more awareness to, I mean, the current situation.
Okay, so we saw this data, and maybe what we can do is let's share and then let's react to it. Kasi parang when we were discussing, nagulat din tayo na. Ito na pala yung numbers. Okay. The first one is, we saw this article and it revealed that 28.4 million Filipinos use buy now, pay later services as of end 2024. And that's growing at a rate of 34.24%.
Wow.
For this year.
Wow. That's why you have to buy more SM Prime.
Buy, not financial advice.
No, let's react to that statement first, right?
How
28 million Filipinos over a 45 million workforce. I assume the ones that can majority of the ones that can
use BNPL.
BNPL, the bigger amounts are working. Yeah. Right? So that's 45 million working Filipinos, 28 million. That's what, 60%?
Yeah, more than half.
More than half of people are using BNPL.
I mean, like, sakto, because our topic last time was about consumer. And that just goes to show na because of these things, it's just being more supported that, Filipinos are continuously spending, and there are more ways to make spending accessible. So sometimes it can be a good thing or a bad thing. Like, for example, especially like you buy electronics, and then let's say you're a digital creator, you can use it for things. If you're doing some businesses that you can leverage on it.
Oh, let's be honest, that's not happening.
Justify ko na yung spending.
But I get it, right? And we talked about flexibility a while ago.
Yes.
Does it make sense for you to pay 0% interest over 6 months? Mathematically, puede. But we all know
if it's stacking,
it becomes
a problem.
And sometimes we're not aware behaviorally that, grabe, ganito na pala laki na yung monthly bill ko.
That's so true.
Diba? So just be conscious of it. I mean, we always talk about it. And, one of the things that we saw was that compared to BNPL in other countries, we're actually on par with Singapore.
Okay, maybe.
Right? And so actually it's a lot have to do maybe with millennials and Gen Z.
Right.
Because there's a much more digitally savvy and financially more savvy, let's be honest. And we're actually on par with Singapore already. Even compared to the other ASEAN countries. Other ASEAN countries are actually pretty low, like sitting sub 20%. Other frontier markets are less than 10% of the total population. Tayo, 28%. Right? So it's not about anything else except that, or concerning. It's just that you just, again, being conscious of how you're going to be spending all that BNPL.
For me personally, I think the BNPL is good. as long as you're financially responsible. I think that's the point because again, it allows you to be more flexible. And as you said, when it comes to inflation, when you try to compute it, let's say you have BNPL 3 months, you're gonna buy now, pay it after 3 months, and then you extend that payment for 6 months. So technically 9 months mo siyang binabayaran.
Basta hindi mo BNPL ang gambling.
Exactly. Yeah, be financially responsible.
Diba? I mean, like, I was shocked initially when I saw the data for some of these things, like 28 million Filipinos. And just to give people an idea, there's also 7.5 million monthly active users on DigiPlus. That's 20% of the workforce. So technically 1 out of 5 adults.
And just to give you guys a perspective, diba? Like, we see the number of how many Filipinos are gambling. We see the number of Filipinos who use BNPL. I mean, like, we don't know how much yung average spending sa BNPL. But just to give you numbers, like here in the Philippines, less than 2% of Filipinos invest their money in the top companies here in the Philippines, or basically in the stock market. So if we can spend for this and we can play with our money, why not, allocate some for our future self? Because again, this is a behavioral thing that encourages instant gratification. And counterintuitively, investing is a delayed gratification. So technically, mas madali talaga ang mag-BNPL, maglaro, right? And investing that's why, diba? Investing is hard. So because it's a self-control thing. So if you're doing this, just be responsible. I think that's what we're trying to bring, and awareness to.
I don't know, man.
And people.
I think the conclusion is, because behavior won't change, the 1% who knows how to do this, just buy more malls, buy more SM Prime. The reason why I'm using SM Prime, it's because I always use malls as the face of consumer spending, right? Because anything that you do, whether electronics, food, restaurant, day-to-day, grocery, department store, the first thing that comes into my mind is SM.
SM Prime. Maybe so, included ba dyan let's say Ayala, because malls, right? Well, or Robinsons.
To some extent, maybe. The problem is Ayala Land is a lot more diversified, and a bigger portion of the business comes from residential sales, right? I mean, it's also part of BNPL, right? But, the property sector is totally different, right? When I look at SM Prime,
SM Malls yung primary
primary business is still the mall segment, right? And the mall segment is 19 billion per quarter at the very least. So you're probably looking at north of 80 billion in terms of mall revenues, diba?
That's crazy. How about Robinsons? Kasi Robinsons, it's a retail din.
If you're talking about Robinsons retail, then yes, you're correct. I think generally, the department store of Robinsons retail has been to the weaker side. But the grocery, the drugstore, which I think is still majority of total revenues, still very healthy in that regard.
So the point here is, if mahina yung department store nila, kailangan nila mag-integrate ng buy now, pay later. Yan ba yun? Okay, so since we're in the topic of the stocks already, this credit, right? This is like line of credit. Is this good or bad for banks in the Philippines?
Well, of course it's good.
BPI.
It's good. It just don't want to come to a period where people cannot pay things back, right? Or employment rate starts to plummet,
right?
Because people are getting let off, then you have to pay for these things, then it's going to become an issue. So one of the key figures that we always talk about and look at is NPL, non-performing loans. So what are non-performing loans? It's the ability for creditors to not pay it back, right? So example, credit card delinquency or NPLs is probably sitting at 3 to 3.5%, for example, today. Nothing really alarming. Compare this to the peak of the pandemic. I think it was sitting at 8.4%. Obviously, because it's pandemic, you might have seen people get laid off or not have ways to pay it back. So it's very different from where we were during the pandemic. So usually anything in this level is really not a concern. It's also the reason why you're seeing other BNPLs. For example, we talked about Klarna in the US, diba? Klarna, less than 0.5% ng NPL, right? So that's the reason why you're seeing more BNPL stocks. For example, like SPayLater, Shopee. We always talk about Shopee because if you look at SE today, SE has actually had a great last year and first quarter performance, both from their e-commerce side and from CBank side. I assume, why is the e-commerce side for Shopee continuing to grow in Asia Pacific? I think it's sitting at 20+% pa rin ng e-commerce growth, right? How did that happen? I assume part of it is also because of
the accessibility.
The accessibility now for SPayLater and buy now, pay later. So some alternative stocks for you to be buying instead.
It's SE. Since we're talking about that and it's not yet alarming, Kasi when it comes to this, what I really think about is what happened back in global financial crisis when real estate, of course, real estate and this consumer products are way different. But do you think it could be a catalyst for that? Mag-default. Of course, we're thinking so much in the future, but it's the point of conversation lang.
Everything happens slowly and then fast. That's the thing. So if we're talking about like hard recession, like 2008, it's gonna happen fast. So you're gonna see default rates, NPLs skyrocket really fast. Right. And it's very hard to predict those things. If you're looking at it from a hard landing perspective, I can understand. The issue is that maybe post GFC, and this is something you might want to research also about soft landing versus hard landing.
Okay.
Hard landing is literally 2008. So the reason why we don't have 2008 type of financial crisis anymore is because one of the ways that they were able to do it was because of quantitative easing, where the world just printed out so much money. Sorry, the US printed out so much money that provided liquidity for everybody to beef up their balance sheets and
Re-stimulate the
economy and prolong any of these bad default or whatsoever that's happening, right? Will we see another one? And if we're seeing any systemic risk, we're always worried about a recession. But I tell people, recession is going to happen continuously throughout the economy. In fact, there's a famous guy on CNBC by Fundstrat, one of my favorite analysts. His name is Tom Lee. And he talks about a rolling recession. So what's a rolling recession? Is that there's a recession happening actually as we speak. So how does that happen? And it's true. Because the last 3 years in the US, there's been a housing recession.
So parang sectoral.
It's sectoral. So the same thing in the Philippines. Right? We've had an oversupply of
condos
and property the last 2 years. Actually, the housing market is in a recession. Diba? Last year, we've seen volumes die down in consumer. So the consumer segment was actually in recession. But on face value, if you look at GDP, it's still growing.
It's still intact. Diba?
So the point being here is that there always, it's called a rolling recession because there's always some pocket of the economy that's actually in a recession.
That's a new thing.
So don't be scared of it unless there's something really hard landing happen. When we talk about hard landing happens because of over leverage.
Right.
Where debt to GDP is just 200, 300%. Then when something goes out of control or some asset, then this is where margin calls come in, etc., etc. I don't know where it's going to come from. If I look at the debt side on the Philippines, really there's nothing.
Nothing to worry about.
Nothing to worry about so far, knock on wood. Hopefully that doesn't change, right? So if that's the case, things can always just be prolonged. And that's what we mean by a rolling recession.
I think that's a good way to look at things. So the point there talaga is when we need to be responsible with these things when it comes to utilizing yung mga buy now pay later.
Hindi, gumastos ka.
Para healthy economy. Para malaking kita ng mga stocks.
So the economy keeps on moving and the consumer stocks keep on outperforming.
I know. Okay, next, let's take a look. So that's the number of Filipinos using buy now pay later. So the value daw of buy now pay later in the Philippines is at around 150 to 160 billion pesos in 2025.
Not bad.
Could be better.
Credit card is 3.4 trillion pesos.
So malayo pa.
And the estimate for credit card is to grow to double in the next 4 years. To 7 trillion the next 4 years.
So that's why we're seeing that big of a CAGR, no? When it comes to these industries. Kasi here in the Philippines, wala tayong stocks na like Klarna, that's really, ito yung core business nila.
I mean, you have GCash, which is set to go IPO, but they have their own challenges. I mean, let's not talk about it. Then you have Shopee, then you have other local companies that are doing it. But again, part of it also the net beneficiaries have been your consumer companies.
Yeah, consumer companies talaga.
Which for me is good also. I mean, that's the reason why we speak highly of SM Prime.
Okay, let's talk about let's go back with consumer companies. Na kasi diba some consumer companies rallied already from the low. So do you think it's already
great question?
Expensive na ba? Ganyan.
This is our dilemma right now. Why? It's because there's not a lot of companies to buy in the PSE. That's our dilemma. We're really trying to help companies go IPO and go public because we're really trying to do education and see what's possible. I understand the frustration of some companies that are not going public. Sorry, we're digressing a bit. But it's just good for people to know because of valuations.
The state of what's happening.
The state of what's happening
with companies here.
Because valuations aren't that attractive, right? Because PSE 11 times.
Yeah.
So if you're gonna IPO,
11 times.
Sabi mo, 12, 13 times, kulang eh.
Yeah.
Diba? So in terms of valuation, that's why there's not enough incentive for companies to go public, right? And also demand is a different issue. We're hoping that capital markets law might change. But anyway, going back to your question about consumer companies. So some have rallied a lot.
Yeah.
So URC rallied 50%. I mean, we've been talking about it for the last 6 months.
Yep.
And we always talk about getting paid to wait because this is the only time I've seen consumer companies get paid 5%.
Yeah.
Even RHI till today. And we've seen them buy back 23 billion at the 50 peso range in total, plus their 8 billion share buyback last week, right? In fact, on top of that, you're still seeing companies issue more cash dividend. For example, like DNL is set to pay out around 3.8%, which is great for investors. The top line or their growth has not yet, I honestly believe, has not yet shown because it's still weak. But because of what we're seeing, you see some tailwinds that are going to happen.
Yeah, exactly. How would you define tailwinds?
Tailwinds are like supporting
growth.
Supporting arguments that will propel you forward, right?
Okay.
So part of it is like we talked about BNPL, credit card, malayo pa eh. We're still far from it, right? All these different types of financial products that allow you some level of flexibility to spend more. Job growth, still relatively healthy. Employment. We talked about the service sector. We talked about the OFW. Still there. So for us, and I mean, from this regard, as long as you're prudent and still spending, I really believe the consumer is still a great place for you to invest.
Yeah.
It's still a sector that we're still seeing pockets of opportunity in. So there's levels to valuations: cheap, fairly valued, expensive. I'd probably categorize most of the consumer companies to cheap.
Now.
But there's problems.
Yeah.
Let's be honest.
Okay.
So it's not cheap because there's no problems, right? They're cheap because there are some problems, right? So the biggest question is, will growth come back? And like what we said with these tailwinds, I think I'm still fairly positive that there is still opportunity for these guys still grow in the next 5 years.
So spend your money. Spend and invest your money wisely. Okay, when I was reading this, majority of the buy now, pay later daw are Gen Zs and millennials.
Yes.
So the older generation, sila ba yung maybe they use more credit cards? And maybe is the buy now, pay later the future credit cards of Gen Zs and millennials?
Well, even some credit cards have BNPL.
BNPL na, no?
So, I don't know. I really don't know. I feel like it's everybody spending.
Yeah.
I feel like you have to tie in credit card spending with BNPL and maybe look at it from that perspective. So from then on, I think it's generally across the board where people are spending.
Yeah. I mean, just a few interesting numbers for you guys is because of this BNPL. Like, you have 17 to 26% more likely to make purchases, 10% larger average purchase size, and then 30% overall increase in discretionary spending. But I have this rule. I don't know if you also think about it, but may certain range akong number that if you can't buy it twice, you can't afford it once. That's my tip, I think, when it comes to being more responsible with these things. Because it's easy for us to justify buying things. Because we buy with emotion and then we justify with logic. So
my job is just to provide awareness. If there's something that's concerning, I will also tell you guys. Right? But behavior, you probably have a better behavioral response to it.
we will keep you guys updated when we see concerning numbers, the BNPL. But that's what's happening in not just in the Philippines but all over the world. So maybe to finalize this, do you think, kasi in the United States, diba, they're using buy now, pay later for Coachella, for concerts, for a burrito. So do you think Filipinos should also buy now, pay later mga concert tickets and Starbucks natin?
Ikaw kaya muna sumagot.
Siyempre hindi. Right? So,
kasi pag tinanong mo ako, kalokohan naman to lahat eh. Ikaw sumagot.
Siyempre hindi, guys. No? So, again, I hope you enjoyed this topic. It's quite different from what we usually talk about. Did you have fun? I had fun talking about this.
I always have fun every episode.
Buy now, pay later. Just in case you have any more topics that you want to discuss, na mga what's happening in the finance space or with personal finance, let us know. Comment down below. And thank you so much for tuning in to Get Rich. So we've hit certain milestones, and we're really grateful for you guys tuning in. We appreciate your comments, and see you guys in the next episode.
See you guys.